Alright, boys and girls, this one's gonna be a quickie. Aristotle states, first, individual human beings combined in pairs, because they could not exist apart. The male and female joined in order to reproduce, and the master and the slave came together for self-preservation. The natural master used his intellect to rule, and the natural slave employed his body to labor. Second, the household arose naturally from these primitive communities in order to serve everyday needs. Third, the several households combined for further needs and village emerged, also according to nature. Finally, the complete community formed from several villages is a city-state, which at once attains the limit of self-sufficiency. Roughly speaking, it comes to be for the sake of life and exists for the sake of a good life. Simply, as an individual or in small packs, of course, people will survive. But we are more productive in larger groups. That way we can thrive. Hey, that rhymed. But who's the conductor? Who steers the ship? The one who convinces everybody they have the answers, that's who. The answers to what? Good question. Moving along, the United States, like most of us know about ancient Greece, is a collection of states, and of course, that works its way back down to individuals and their individual drives, their individual wants, their desires, and their fears. Oh yes, their fears. There have been tons of political parties in the United States. About 47 are active, like the Whigs, not those Whigs, the American Communist Party, the Marijuana Party, and the American Pirate Party. Yes, I said pirates. But politics seems to be dominated by two parties, the only two parties in national debates, the only two parties the kids learn about in school, the only two parties most of us think about when we think about politics or politicians. I keep telling people, if you want to know about American politics, you've got to know Star Wars. First up, we have the Grand Old Party, the party of Thomas Jefferson, the philosophical slave master with the heart of gold. The Republicans continued where the pre-constitutional anti-federalists left off. Look it up. I'm trying to hurry. Next, the Federalists. They believed in strong national government with centralized authority. Soon, the two parties would merge, exchange ideas, and like a butterfly from a cocoon, two new parties were formed, the Democrats and the Republicans, who retained the name because, well, why not? It was glorious between the two. There were screaming matches, fistfights, tricks. Oh, there were so many tricks. Voter tampering, voter intimidation. I mean, these two were like spy versus spy, but hey. So what blew these two bands of good fellows up to superstardom? What made them the first name you think about when it comes to politics? That's right, ladies and germs. War. And there were lots. The Civil War. Oh, the Civil War. And the subsequent Negro problem. Oh yes, this became both parties' pièce de résistance. Yes, Thomas Jefferson quandered. That freed a few slaves after the Revolutionary War. But America's economy was still based in that peculiar institution. The Republicans had little interest in civil rights, not until the South left the Congress, took their ball and went home. You know, the Civil War? Not that one. Anyway, the GOP was interested in punishing the South for the seceding and monopolizing the new black vote. But by the 1890s, Republicans had begun to distance themselves from civil rights, especially considering those Democrats were so good at convincing black folks to vote Democrat or not at all. And hey, the Republicans didn't do such a hot job with that emancipation thing anyway. So of course, there was no African American voting bloc. So civil rights? But the black vote? Yes, the black vote has always been important.
Say, well, you can't have a poll tax. They can say you can't have a gas tax or a cigarette tax or anything else. Federal government's telling the states pretty tough what their business is. Now, you can say that they can't discriminate, but I've got to prove that it discriminates. Now, I can't prove it in Texas. There are more niggers voting there now than white folks. There are more of them buying poll taxes now than white folks. Higher percentage of them. And I can't show that the literacy test is discriminated against because they haven't got any. They got no test at all. Just by God, anybody that can get up and pay $1.06 can vote.
Yep, that's the guy that finally passed the Civil Rights Act after just 100 years of deliberation. Attaboy, Lindy. Of course, there were those in the good old boy party that had their objections. Strom Thurmond, the guy that held office for 8 lifetimes. Well, never mind. He remained a Democrat until 1964. He also gave the longest filibuster in Senate history, speaking for 24 hours against the 1957 Civil Rights Act. You really can't make this stuff up. In 1960, Kennedy defeats Nixon. At the time of his election, both parties unevenly supported civil rights. But President Kennedy decided to move forward, though during his time in the Senate, he voted against it. And Jack's support of civil rights had more to do with the international image of the country. America had to look like the place to be. Overall, Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act out of 1964. Democrats, not so much. Basically, the South wasn't with it at all. The South had become disillusioned. I mean, what would the song of the South sound like without the sweet voice of Jim Crow? The good old boys were mad, and they were going to do something about it. This is the point when the grand old party decides to jump in the game. They couldn't rely on black Republicans. I mean, the Dixiecrats made it very difficult to organize politically. The Republicans developed the Southern strategy, a plan to woo white Southern voters to the party for the 1968 election. That's right, Tricky Dick. The Kennedy and Johnson administration had advanced civil rights largely through national legislation and direct executive actions. So the Southern strategy was the opposite. States' rights and no integration. States' rights to bar black people from, everything important. Born-again Republican Jesse Helms said racial quotas prevented white people from getting jobs. The lie of racial quotas persists in the GOP's rejection of affirmative actions. Racial quotas are illegal. Helmsy also popularized special interests. He says, "Are civil rights only for Negroes? While white women in Washington who have been raped and mugged on the streets in broad daylight have experienced the most revolting sort of violation of their civil rights? The hundreds of others who have their purses snatched by Negro hoodlums may understandably insist that their right to walk the streets unmolested was violated." This is the point when the Republican stance on black folks changed. Once a people who needed to be uplifted so that all Americans can indeed believe in the tenets expressed in the Declaration of Independence, the American dream, becomes a teeming pack of wild hoodlums on the loose. After receiving the nod from MLK, black folks swarmed to the Democratic Party. I mean, think about it. What Democrat hasn't pandered to black people in some way, shape, or form, passing difficult to enforce legislation? Or legislation that would hurt black people in the long run? Or legislation for black people, but really not for black people? Then, of course, guilting you into voting for them, while the Republicans jockey for the Southern votes using innuendos and words of art to justify prejudiced attitudes, meanwhile giving these good old boys new catchwords and phrases to hide their old perspectives about non-whites in general and blacks specifically. Are they genuine feelings or are they engineered? We'll talk about that another time. Do you remember the last 17 years? Bush, Obama, Trump? Ask anybody why they don't like Trump. Well, because he's racist. Not because he's a goofy rich guy. No. Not because he's a bit obnoxious. Nope. Because he's racist. Legislation won't change prejudice. It won't soften intolerance. It only puts a cork on it. And when it pops, well, there'll be someone to clean up the mess and make a lot of money doing it. Well, that's all. Good night or good day, whatever.